Please welcome His Excellency the Prime Minister of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. You are very welcome, Your Excellency. If I could ask everyone who is standing to please take your seats now as we begin the official opening of the session. Your Excellency, Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Your Excellency, Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission, Your Excellency, the ES of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. That was a wonderful panel. Thank you very much for chairing that. Honorable ministers and delegations, our new chair, Minister from Sudan, congratulations for your appointment. Senior executives from Africa's private sector are also with us, professors and researchers from academic institutes from within Africa and beyond. And we have, of course, representatives from the regional economic communities, and we have members of both the Pan-African and the international media in attendance. Many of you have traveled many miles to be here at the Economic Commission for Africa's Conference of African Ministers of Finance, Planning and Economic Development for 2018. I'd like to say to all of you a very warm welcome. I'm Mark Edo, and I have the pleasure of being your guide for most of the day. I always like to say your traffic warden. That means I'll be timekeeping and make so that we can make the most of this gathering. Now, if I could ask you to turn your attentions to the screen behind us, because what we're about to show you is a gentleman called the champion of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Without his passion and leadership, we would not be here today. So, without much ado, some words from His Excellency, the President of Niger, Mahamadou Issoufou.
Mesdames et messieurs, je voudrais saluer la tenue de la 51e session de la Commission économique pour l'Afrique et la conférence des ministres africains des Finances, dont le thème principal est la zone de libre-échange continentale, créer une marge d'action budgétaire en faveur de l'emploi et de la diversification économique. Ce thème me donne l'occasion de m'adresser à l'assistance pour parler de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, un des programmes phares de l'Union africaine. La 28e session ordinaire tenue à Addis Ababa en janvier 2017, m'a chargé de piloter le processus de négociation de la zone de libre-échange continentale en me désignant comme champion. Cette décision a été le tournant décisif pour les négociations sur la zone de libre-échange continentale engagées depuis plusieurs années. Je suis heureux d'annoncer que le processus d'élaboration des instruments juridiques créant et régissant la zone de libre-échange continentale est arrivé à son terme, avec la signature par 44 États africains de l'accord constitutif et de ces 3 protocoles fondamentaux. Dès lors, il me paraît tout à fait indiqué que nous engagions un processus de communication sur la zone de libre-échange continentale en direction des citoyens, des leaders politiques, des administrations publiques du continent, en commençant par vous, les responsables des administrations économiques et financières. En effet, de par votre rôle dans la collecte des impôts et taxes et de la définition des politiques économiques et financières de nos États, vous êtes des partenaires clés dans la mise en œuvre de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine. La ZLEC est un engagement de l'ensemble des États membres de l'Union africaine à créer un grand marché pour l'Afrique et permettre la libre circulation des biens, des services et des personnes pour le continent. Ce programme consiste en une suppression totale, à terme, de toutes les barrières tarifaires. L'Afrique est en effet trop balkanisée, avec près de 84 000 km de frontières, avec des obstacles tarifaires et non tarifaires qui limitent les échanges entre les États du continent. La zone de libre-échange continental constitue une source d'opportunités énormes pour les États membres, pour les citoyens de l'Union, pour les entreprises africaines, pour les investisseurs étrangers, pour le marché financier et pour les autres nations du monde. Au titre des potentialités et des opportunités qu'offre la zone de libre-échange continentale, on peut citer sans être exhaustif les apports suivants. L'intensification des échanges entre les États africains, le développement des infrastructures de base, le développement des chaînes de valeur, le développement d'un véritable marché intégré de travail, la génération d'une croissance forte et inclusive, la signature des instruments juridiques de création de la zone de libre-échange continentale n'est pas bien sûr une fin en soi. Il reste encore du travail à accomplir pour la rendre opérationnelle et chacun de vous peut y contribuer. Nos experts et nos ministres doivent compléter les 10 textes juridiques par des annexes et des appendices. Il nous faut engager une large campagne de sensibilisation, de façon à ce que tous les citoyens africains s'approprient la zone de libre-échange continentale et prennent conscience de ses avantages. Il nous faut engager la deuxième phase de négociation en vue d'adopter le protocole sur les investissements, le protocole sur la concurrence et le protocole sur la propriété intellectuelle. Il nous faut enfin ratifier dans les meilleurs délais cet accord et ce protocole afin d'accélérer leur entrée en vigueur. Avec la zone de libre-échange continentale, l'Afrique est en train de poser les jalons historiques dans sa marche vers le progrès économique et social de ses populations. Sa marginalisation actuelle dans le commerce mondial, avec un poids de 2% des échanges, touche à sa fin. En signant l'accord instituant la zone de libre-échange et ses protocoles, nous renonçons implicitement à une partie de notre souveraineté nationale. Nous le savons. Mais que représente la perte partielle de la souveraineté nationale devant la perspective heureuse d'un bénéfice global de la création d'une Afrique intégrée, prospère et paisible sous la conduite de ses propres citoyens et représentant une force dynamique dans le système international tel qu'envisagé dans l'agenda 2063 de l'Union africaine. Je vous remercie de votre aimable attention, mesdames et messieurs.
I had the luxury of being on stage with His Excellency, the President of Niger, during the signing ceremony in Kigali. He is a champion of Africa. Now, we mentioned and we congratulated the new chair of the Bureau. I'd like to now ask you to please welcome with robust applause that reflects how grateful we are for the work that this gentleman has done, the chair of the outgoing Bureau, the Minister from Senegal, Amadou Ba, to give the first opening statement.
Je vous remercie. Excellences, Monsieur le Premier ministre de la République fédérale et démocratique d'Éthiopie, Dr Abiy Ahmed, Excellences, Monsieur le Secrétaire général adjoint des Nations Unies, Madame la Secrétaire exécutive de la Commission économique pour l'Afrique, Madame Vera Songwe, Mesdames et Messieurs les ministres, Mesdames et Messieurs les gouverneurs, Mesdames et Messieurs les ambassadeurs, membres du corps diplomatique, Mesdames et Messieurs les représentants des organisations internationales, honorables invités, l'honneur m'échoit ce matin de prendre en premier la parole à l'occasion de la cérémonie d'ouverture de la 51e session de la conférence des ministres africains des finances, de la planification et du développement économique. Permettez-moi tout d'abord d'exprimer toute ma gratitude au gouvernement et au peuple de la République fédérale démocratique d'Éthiopie pour l'hospitalité et l'accueil chaleureux dont j'ai été l'objet, ainsi que ma délégation. Au moment de passer le témoin au bureau entrant, je voudrais remercier la Commission économique pour l'Afrique et l'ensemble de mes collègues ministres pour le choix qui a été porté sur le Sénégal, au nom de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, pour la présidence de la 50e session de notre conférence. Je voudrais également remercier et féliciter tous les membres du bureau sortant pour l'excellent travail abattu durant la 50e session. L'année 2017 aura été marquée, entre autres, par l'accélération des négociations en vue de la mise en place de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine. Cet engagement des États africains a été couronné par la signature à Kigali, le 21 mars 2018, de l'accord instaurant la zone de libre-échange continentale. On ne saurait parler de cet accord sans mentionner le rôle important que la CIA, en collaboration avec d'autres partenaires, a joué dans l'appui des États africains membres à travers des études, rapports et analyses qui ont largement contribué à l'aboutissement des différentes phases du processus ayant permis cette signature. On ne doute point que la CIA continuera à nous apporter le même soutien dans les phases ultérieures du processus. Tout aussi déterminante, la Commission économique pour l'Afrique l'a également été, dans des avancées notables enregistrées au niveau des chantiers de l'intégration et du développement en Afrique, à savoir le renforcement des capacités des États membres dans l'adaptation des stratégies et plans nationaux de développement dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre des agendas 2030 et 2063, le développement des statistiques et le renforcement de l'intégration économique. Je voudrais donc réitérer les remerciements du Bureau à l'endroit de la CIA et de son secrétaire exécutif, Madame Vera Songwe, pour le travail remarquable accompli et l'accompagnement des États africains dans leurs efforts inlassables de développement. Merci, Madame Songwe, pour votre engagement au service de l'Afrique. Merci pour votre engagement pour le développement de l'Afrique. J'ai eu le privilège de vous connaître dans une autre vie et j'ai vu comment vous êtes engagé pour que l'Afrique sorte enfin de cet état. Mesdames et Messieurs, la croissance économique du continent s'est améliorée en 2017, après un repli en 2016, à la faveur d'une légère hausse des cours des produits de base, de l'augmentation des investissements, notamment dans les infrastructures, de la forte croissance de la demande intérieure. Mais cette croissance reste fragile, sans une diversification et une transformation structurelle des économies. L'atteinte de nos objectifs de développement inclusif passera nécessairement par l'industrialisation et le renforcement de l'intégration. seuls à même de réaliser des économies d'échelle et stimuler la production et le commerce intra-africain. De ce point de vue, la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine devrait être un puissant vecteur pour réussir la transformation du continent. D'où la pertinence du thème de notre présente conférence, Zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, créer une marge d'action budgétaire en faveur de l'emploi et de la diversification économique. En effet, ce thème s'intègre parfaitement dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre de l'agenda de développement du continent. En diminuant des droits de douane sur les produits africains, la ZLEC offrira de nouvelles opportunités de valeur ajoutée dans les secteurs des ressources naturelles, mais elle offrira également des possibilités de diversification des exportations industrielles. Toutefois, pour y arriver, il est nécessaire d'accroître les investissements dans la création de nouvelles capacités productives. En tant que ministre des Finances, de la Planification et du Développement, nous avons un rôle essentiel à jouer afin que la zone de libre-échange en construction puisse tenir toutes ses promesses, en renforçant le commerce intra-africain, la coopération entre les pays africains et mettre définitivement notre continent sur la rampe du développement économique et social. Nous y arriverons par une amélioration continue de la mobilisation de ressources intérieures, le renforcement de l'efficacité des dépenses publiques, la lutte contre la corruption et les flux illicites en vue de dégager des marges budgétaires nécessaires pour financer les objectifs de développement durable et l'agenda 2063. En concluant mon propos, je voudrais souhaiter plein succès aux travaux de la présente session et vous remercier de votre aimable attention ainsi que plein succès au nouveau président entrant. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. The Chair of the outgoing Bureau, Minister of Finance for the Republic of Senegal, Amadou Ba. Now, in March, many of us were in Kigali, many of us here, to witness history in the making as the AFCFTA was signed by 44 countries. It was a remarkable step and a big statement by Africa to the rest of the world that it's time for Africa to trade with Africa. But the AFCFTA will only succeed if finance ministers of African nations are front and center. There's so much that we need to understand about the finance of trade. We need to understand about the dynamics of trade finance markets in Africa, how to create the fiscal space to foster both public and private investment. This is of vital importance. We African nations must take bold actions to realize the promise of the AFCFTA. In fact, our host in this great building, the Executive Secretary of UNECA, Vera Songwe, says that together with diversification of our economies, creating that fiscal space is the most important and urgent next step. So please, to give her opening remarks, please welcome Executive Secretary Vera Songwe.
Good morning. Excellency Dr. Abiy Ahmed, Prime Minister of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, Excellency Ambassador Kwesi Kwache, Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission, outgoing Chair of the Bureau of the COM, the Minister of Senegal, incoming Chair of the Bureau, the Minister of Sudan, Honorable Ministers, African Union Commissioners, colleagues, Under-Secretary Generals of the United Nations, heads of the United Nations Systems Organizations in Addis Ababa, and those of you who have come from afar, the Governor of the Central Bank of Ireland, Mr. Philip Lane, special guest, including, I must stop and say, our former Executive Secretary. Where are you? I saw you this morning, but welcome and thank you. There you are, yes. Thank you for being here with us. Dr. K.Y. Amoko, Excellencies, Ambassadors, members of the Diplomatic Corps, our UN family, staff, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I am deeply honored to welcome you here today in Addis Ababa at the ECA campus for the UN conference on the 51st session of the Conference of African Ministers of Finance, Planning and Economic Development and Central Bank Governors, held under the theme, the African Continental Free Trade Area and Fiscal Space for Jobs and Economic Diversification. Let me especially thank, before I continue, His Excellency, the Prime Minister of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, for his presence here today and his indulgence. We're deeply honored to have you amongst us. Thank you very much. When we say that Africa is on the move, I think he is a picture of exactly the Africa that we want. Since its founding in 1958, and this year we are celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Economic Commission for Africa, we take pride in our ability to capitalize on our strengths, to be able to deliver for Africa from an intellectual perspective, but also from an implementation perspective, what the continent needs to build strong institutions. I am proud to say that as part of building those strong institutions, the ECA was part of the establishment of the African Development Bank, and we have the honor today to have one of the former presidents of the African Development Bank, President Donald Kaberuka, with us in the hall. At the time in 1958, what Africa was doing was building institutions just to ensure that communities work and that basic services are provided. I think when you fast forward to today, 2018, 60 years later, there clearly is a need for a different kind of Pan-Africanism. It is no longer the Pan-Africanism that says we're trying to build our institutions, we're trying to get independence. It is a moment of economic Pan-Africanism. And I think that is what is bringing us here today. The realization, and we heard from the first panel, that economics, trade, and what links us is really what is going to make sure that Africa becomes truly one of the great continents of the world. I just want to start by talking about the Continental Free Trade Agreement and what it really means when we look at it in numbers. And I have a slide that shows a little bit the linkages of the continent and who is linked to who and how. I don't know if we can put that slide up. I'm going to be quick. So the first slide is going to give you a sense of some of the great. So there you have it. Those are our road corridors. When we talk about trade and intra-regional trade or intercontinental trade, we're really looking at how goods move on the continent, where they move from and how they come back. And when you look at this slide, we have 7 road corridors today on the continent that represent about 3% of our land mass, 20% of our population, and 17% of all the activity on the continent. One of them, of course, is Alexandria to Addis, Marrakesh to Tunis, Dakar to Niamey, Abidjan to Lagos, Point Noir to Luanda, and Cape Town to Lusaka. If you look at them individually and we break them down, let's start with the Abidjan to Lagos, which is the next slide. You see that the Abidjan to Lagos roadway basically has 34% of the economy between traversing about 6 countries. In that small stretch, you have 34% of economic activity happening. If we're able to provide the kind of infrastructure that is needed, and in particular for finance ministers, the border logistics and efficiency that could make it possible for goods to flow back and forth freely, then we will actually be putting more than 36% already of that portion of the population in these 6 countries works on this particular road network. If we could improve the road network and ensure that the CFTA came into being, then we will be able to agglomerate a lot more employment and jobs in this one road corridor. Dakar to Niamey, we just heard from the Minister of Senegal, is the other slide. Can we put that up? Again, another 4 or 5 countries that it traverses. 50% of the economy of these 5 countries on this road network. 28% of the economy is employed, 50% of them have bank accounts, 40% are the consumers for whom we hope to diversify our economies. Next slide is the East Africa Corridor. It is even more telling. The East Africa Corridor is also something that will eventually link up to the One Belt, One Road project, and so basically linking African continental trade to the rest of the world, and in particular Asia. This is 10% of the whole landmass of East Africa, but it has 50% of the economic activity of East Africa happens on this landmass, and it crosses 7 countries. That is why the Continental Free Trade Area is important for all of us. It is important because our people are already trading with each other. Our networks and our road networks show that there is already a lot of integration happening. The CFTA is here to ensure that we now put the institutions together that ensure that this trading and this commerce can happen in a seamless fashion. But not only is that going to happen, but we also know that when we enhance trade, when we improve these networks, we increase female literacy because women begin to work. The roads and the trade allow for more employment by women. We have an additional 130,000 women that will be able, with simulations, to start working if we can improve on intra-Africa trade. We have about 30% of the combined population of all these countries that will have higher incomes. And this is the jobs and prosperity part of the CFTA. Because as we know, Agenda 2063 says we want to leave no one behind. So we must make sure that we learn from the others. And as Sheikh Anta Diop once said, intellectuals ought to study the past, not for the pleasure in doing so, but to derive lessons from the past. Sheikh Anta Diop, of course, was a great Senegalese Pan-Africanist. At the time, he was fighting for political independence. We are now still talking about Pan-Africanism, but an economic one. We have learned from the past, and we know that if you do free trade agreements and you leave some people behind, there will be a backlash. So what we are now doing is saying, how can we do this and ensure that we also bring everybody else with us? We ensure that the women and the youth can get jobs out of the CFTA. We have heard this morning that to do that, we need to strengthen our institutions. We need to ensure that our customs and our tax systems work. We need to ensure that the gains from the CFTA are equally distributed across the continent. Part of this year's basic theme of the African Union, and again I thank the Deputy Chairperson for being with us, is about anti-corruption. We know that corruption hurts us the most at our borders, with our customs unions, with our revenue offices. For us to ensure that the CFTA is effective and works well, we will have to ensure that corruption is stemmed from these agencies that are going to make it happen. So again, I think we're doing a lot of work to make sure that as we move towards boosting intra-Africa trade, a big element of that, Deputy Chairperson, is fighting corruption and winning the fight against corruption. And we're very glad and thankful that you allow us to stand with you on this. There has been a big discussion on the continent. GDP growth is rising. It has gone up from 1.6% to 3.8. It's expected to be 3.9 next year as well. So Africa is growing again. But we are not growing as fast as we grew before. We are not growing at 6%, and we are not growing at numbers that rival Ethiopia's growth at 8.8%. We need to do better as a continent if we are going to provide jobs for our youth. And this new economic Pan-Africanism is really about ensuring that we can create the kinds of jobs that ensure that the youth can be employed. It is not necessarily only jobs in the manufacturing sector. We know that the service sector is also growing and growing very fast on the continent. The CFTA is also a lot about the service sector and how the service sector will provide the jobs that are needed for the youth. Increasingly, the work in the economic literature shows that as manufacturing begins to stabilize, the service sector actually is an area where we can get much higher productivity gains and much higher increases in revenue. So the CFTA looks at both manufacturing and the service sector as a way of pulling Africa out of the slow growth period into a higher growth environment. We hope that with the Ministers of Finance here today, we can find a way and a means to work together to help us we do the ratification, that you also open the borders, that you ensure that goods can move from one place to the other. As we will hear from the Irish governor of the central bank, not everything needs to be produced in one location. We're going to have value chains. The South African region is now talking about pharmaceutical value chains. We're talking about mineral valuation and mineral beneficiation on the continent. I think that the Minister of Ghana talked about fertilizer, using phosphates from Morocco, gas from Ghana, and nitrates from Mozambique to ensure that we can get fertilizer on the continent. This is the promise of the CFTA, that we will be proud of talking about made in Africa because we will have a supply chain that traverses the continent. It is on that note, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, that the ECA is also trying to repurpose itself, reshape itself to ensure that we can respond to the requests of the countries and our member states in answering the questions that will be needed to make sure that we can get quickly to the ratification of the CFTA. We have 8 to make the first 10 and 22 to get to Mauritania. What is ECA doing? We have restructured ourselves. We are working more on the issues of governance. Deputy Chairperson, you will be happy to know that governance is now front and center of the work that we do. We have also decided to create a private sector division at the ECA to be able to answer and respond to some of the requests of our member states about how we can ensure that we bring the private sector. After all, the CFTA is about trade, it's about manufacturing. It is essentially about getting the private sector to get our youths to work. So we want to ensure that we can create the right environment for this to work. Secondly, we have decided to pick up 5 strategic directions for the ECA. The first strategic direction, as I said, is retooling the staff of the ECA to be able to move into this new Pan-African environment where we'll be talking about capital markets, artificial intelligence, new technology. How can Africa increase its productivity using these new tools in the market? To leapfrog, we don't necessarily need to go at the pace of East Asia. We can do faster, we can do better. And the ECA is retooling itself for that. The second is to ensure that we maintain macroeconomic stability and fiscal prudence. Of course, for us to be able to grow, and we heard from the governor again of the central bank this morning, what happens when you have a crisis. And he did say crises will come, but we have to make sure that we have the institutions that ensure that we have some resilience behind us when those crises come. Our third strategic direction is on infrastructure and innovative financing. We need to be able to innovate and find new ways of financing our growth and our development and ensuring that the youth of tomorrow have hope and prosperity on the continent and not somewhere else. So we are working to ensure that no one is left behind. The vulnerable are included, the women, the youth, and the elderly. Our fourth strategic direction is transboundary issues. We know today that the continent is plagued by a number of transboundary issues. If you cannot solve them at a member state level, you must solve them at the regional and intra-regional level. I think here of issues like the Sahel, and I thank the ministers of Niger and the minister of Mauritania for a very fruitful discussion that we had yesterday. When we talk about road corridors, we're also talking about transboundary issues. How can we finance them? What kinds of financing can we come together to do? We mentioned the success stories of the OMVS and other regions that are managing transboundary assets. We need to do more, we need to do better. I think here in Ethiopia, we're also talking about the management of a transboundary asset, which is the Nile Valley, and the energy that it can provide to power the CFTA. To do the CFTA, we must power Africa with a lot more energy, and we know that a lot of the investment that is going to come from that is going to need transboundary agreements. How do we do that? ECA is positioning itself to be able to support countries and the region to do that. And finally, there is a lot of talk about Africa and what Africa is doing and not doing, but we need global advocates. We need to be able to advocate for Africa on the global stage, at the G20, at the IMF, at the World Bank, at the G7. And the ECA is also positioning itself to have a position to talk about particularly illicit financial flows, and that goes back to the question of anti-corruption. We know on the continent and from the Thabo Mbeki report that we cannot fight corruption alone on the continent. We need our partners on the continent and without to support us. So hopefully the ECA can also be an advocate for the continent's issues. Increasingly, African countries are doing much better improving their business environments. Every year we have at least 5 countries in the doing business top 10. This is a pride for us, but we need to make sure that the rest of the world knows that. We have just heard today 3 countries, Angola, Senegal, and Ghana have gone to the markets. They've got good rates, but maybe we can do better working with central banks to improve the rating agencies, Governor Lane, and ensure that the risk perception on the continent is not what it is, so that we can even get better than Senegal, Angola, and Ghana got when they went to the markets, and that we can get longer-term revenue and resources to power our development. So it is with these 5 strategic directions that I leave you, member states. And thank you very much again for your presence here. And I hope that the rest of the day will be a fruitful one. Once again, I want to thank the distinguished panel for being here. I also want to thank, and all this work that we're doing with the 5 strategic directions, of course, comes together in the SDGs and Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. All of the UN agencies, and I think all of us on the continent are present in some way here today. as a testament of the Secretary General Gutierrez's engagement that he has for Africa, both on the peace and security frame, but also on the development framework. We have recently signed an agreement on the development framework with the African Union, I think to emphasize the Secretary General's belief that if you want to succeed with the SDGs by 2030, you must succeed in Africa. He repeats that, we believe it, as a UN agency, and I think the whole UN family is here today to support the member states to ensure that we can get to Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, together. I also want to thank the African Development Bank, of course. That is our partner in financing a lot of the development that the continent will have to undertake. Thank you for your kind attention.
And thank you, Executive Secretary Vera Songwe, for those words of Pan-African economic prosperity, inclusive mutual prosperity in Africa. Now, I mentioned how much of a historic moment it was when African nations signed the AFCFTA. It was a success and a moment for Africa, but it was also a big success and a moment for the African Union Commission that worked tirelessly, many people behind the scenes, to get us to that point where 44 nations signed that historic pact. So for the first statement by our special guests, it gives me great pleasure on behalf of the African Union Commission to call on the Deputy Chairperson of the AUC, His Excellency, Mr. Thomas Kwesi Quartey. Give him a round of applause, please.
Good morning, everybody. Your Excellency, the Right Honorable Dr. Abiy Ahmed, Prime Minister of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, Your Excellency, my dear sister, Dr. Vera Songwe, Executive Secretary of the ECA, Honorable Ministers of Finance, colleague commissioners, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I bring you the fraternal greetings of His Excellency Dr. Musa Faki Mahamat, who would have very much liked to be here, but has been unavoidably held up. I am delighted and honored in equal measure to be part of this engagement at developing an integrated approach to addressing our continent's challenges. The recent signing of the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement was a truly historical development, and even more historic that it happened in Kigali, one of our most beautiful and cleanest cities. We have learned that the ratification process has begun in earnest, with two countries, Kenya and Ghana, already having deposited their instruments of ratification, and more on the way. Now, Africa's ability to trade with itself, as well as with the rest of the world, will be the game changer. The potential for intra-African trade to drive value creation and development is real. But in order to trade, Africa first has to produce. And not just primary commodities. We have to process and add value. But that means leveraging science and technology in production, in agriculture. That means, above all, education for our children, for every African child. That is why it's our aim and vision to see every African child in school and staying in school. Statistical evidence, Your Excellency, show that whenever intra-African trade increased by a factor of, say, 2%, GDP rises by about 10%. So, intra-African trade also tends to happen with processed goods, not just primary products. So that means intra-African trade can help and be helped by our education, our science and technology, which becomes critical. Africa's ability to do business is what is going to drive the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. The potential of Africa's integration into African trade are enormous if we take advantage of economies of scale, creation of job opportunities, generation of income, mobility of investment capital, and exploring a consumer market of nearly 1 billion people. If we can get this thing moving, we shall see less and less of our very energetic youth seeking to cross the Sahara on foot, getting drowned in the Mediterranean in an attempt to reach a non-existent El Dorado in an Europe we just don't want them. So the potential is enormous in many, many directions. As the rest of the world appears to get more fractured, we must advance our integration agenda and advance from 55 fragmented economies into a larger market with the prospect of a combined GDP of over $3 million annually. And if you look at the forecast from intra-African trade simulations, CFTA will increase the consumer spending to 1.4 trillion by 2020, and similarly increase intra-African trade by as much as 35 billion per year. So there are a number of points that we have to take note of. First, we must begin to interrogate why with such a potential intra-African trade presently stands as so low. I believe the answer lies in our history, and in that history, we have to locate it. If we say we need to integrate, it is an admission that logically we are less than integral. And I want to suggest that we look at this and look at the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, where the continent was cut up. And we are slowly trying to disentangle the knots into which we were tied from Berlin. The present borders are the borders from Berlin. So it is in our interest as an African continent, seriously, as Sheikh Anta Diop says, to look into our past. It is our interest to look for the proceedings of that Berlin Conference and to read it and get our children to understand that we were not always divided up. And that integration is probably the more natural of the processes. We must also scale up our infrastructure for integrated development. We need infrastructure that links up our various countries. As we stand now, and I can speak for Ghana because that's what I know, the railways are from the mines to the harbor. They are from the gold mines or the diamond mines to the harbor. Beneficiation is minimal. We pride ourselves in exporting gold bullion. But if you look at Obuasi, which has produced gold over the years, it is pathetic. And this replicates itself in various places. At the same time, seeking to travel from one African country to another can be an ordeal. Just try taking an articulated load of goods from Ghana to Togo, not even Benin. Gary Lavatu and Levele shows normal. Mr. Prime Minister, whilst you're here with respect, trying to get a visa into Ethiopia is not the easiest of tasks. Perhaps you could help us in that as well. I also like to state that we have to increase our capacity to produce. In this world now, science and technology is what is driving production. And not just production of oil and other commodities. The world is moving slowly into the globalized and digital economy. To be able to drive this value and to be able to partake of this economy, you cannot afford to be illiterate. You need to be numerate and literate with a high level of culture. So our vision, Mr. Prime Minister, distinguished delegates, is for all our children to be in school. We are dreaming of an Africa where every child is in school, where every child is beginning to be literate and numerate and has an elevated culture. And when I say this, people tell me I'm a little crazy, I need to be a little crazy to work in the African Union sometimes. Cross-border trade is another. So, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, education, 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 science and technology is the key. And when we are looking at human capacity development, we believe that African children are as brilliant as anybody, and perhaps even more so. So I'd simply like to conclude by reiterating, Your Excellencies, the need for developing and enhancing a multilateral trade culture. And Africa, as we know, the very shape of Africa, Kwame Nkrumah told us, is a question mark, an eternal question mark, poverty in the midst of plenty. So the only way we can do this is to increase our capacity, our intellectual capacity for which we have such potential. And I'd like to conclude by stating and quoting from what Kwame Nkrumah said in South Africa must unite more than 50 years ago. The thesis, Africa must unite, remains unassailable. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, the Deputy Chairperson of the AUC, Mr. Thomas Kwesi Kwate, for those very inspiring words. It benefits us to look into our past, to see our path to the future. Now, Ireland's economy is doing well. Do you know how well it's doing? Very, very well. Surging job creation means full employment is almost in sight for Ireland. Exports are way up. At home, economic growth is being underpinned by a steady increase in consumer spending. It's great then to have as our guests from across the waters the Governor of the Central Bank of Ireland, Mr. Philip Lane, to share his thoughts and experiences. Please welcome him.
Good morning. Your Excellency, Dr. Ahmed, Prime Minister of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, Your Excellency, Dr. Songwe, Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, my fellow panelists, ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm very much honored to be invited to address this conference this morning, so thank you for the invitation. The topic this morning, where we're talking about the continental free trade area, for me, what I can offer is perspective from a small country that has really benefited over the last 45 years from membership of the European Union. So in my remarks, that's what I'm going to focus on, is how has membership of a free trade agreement helped us to develop? Because really, when we go back to 1973, when we joined what was then the European Economic Community, we were quite poor compared to the European average. At that point, we were the poorest member of the European area. Our income was about half of the normal European income level. We were very much dependent on exporting unprocessed agricultural products. So I'm sure some of this seems quite familiar to some of you. We were also, in terms of concentration, excessively dependent on trading with the UK. At that point, over 60% of exports went just to one market, to the UK. And really, we had a very difficult economic situation where there was high levels of unemployment, high immigration, low productivity, and essentially a lack of diversification, still even at that point excessive dependence on the agricultural sector. So now it's quite different. Now the population has grown quite a bit. Now our home market, rather than being the home market of 4.7 million, which is the local population, really the home market is 500 million, which is the size of the European Union. So having that large home market is so important, not just for trade within Europe, but for global trade. And let me come back to that in a minute. Because number one, there are scale effects from having a large home market. And number two is essentially European Union membership for global firms, for global customers, that provides them with a lot of assurance, a lot of simplicity in relation to understanding the regulations and the product standards. So when they purchase something produced in Ireland, they know they don't have to work out what is the Irish regulation, what is the Irish code. They just need to know the EU code. So as I mentioned earlier on, having a convergence in regulatory standards, I think, is quite important. Now, let me emphasize is that there's a deep connection between trade and overall living standards, both for local firms and for the multinational firms that are attracted through FDI. Really, only through the scale possible through exporting can productivity be improved. So that this is definitely the leading sector of the economy, and the rest of the economy very much depends on progress in the exporting sector. As I mentioned earlier on, having a large exporting sector also provides stability because the exporting sector has the international customer base. So if there's a problem at home, if there's a recession at home, it provides diversification, and that's an important source of economic and financial stability. Let me mention in terms of the transformation through free trade, that has included international manufacturing. It has included a move towards higher value added in agriculture, which I know has been mentioned this morning as an important policy goal. But beyond manufacturing, what is meant is that if you do build a single market, that allows for trade in international services, international financial services, international business services, tourism, and so on. I think very importantly, the way to think about a regional or continental free trade agreement is it's a platform for trading with the world because of these scale effects. So Ireland now trades with very many countries, whereas historically it was much more dependent, especially on the UK. Let me emphasize the potential role for multinational firms. So as a small economy, the reason why multinational firms will set up in Ireland is not to serve the Irish market, although that is part of what goes on. The main goal is to be an export platform, because the local market for a small economy is just too small. So typically these firms in Ireland are looking to serve actually not just the EU, but more broadly the Europe, Middle East, North Africa regions. Let me emphasize also, it's not just about the multinationals. Domestic firms, with the mindset change that was mentioned earlier on, with the mindset change of recognizing through a single market, it's possible to have greater levels of ambition. So that's really a description of what's been happening, of the transformation of the economy. So, you know, what lessons is it possible to learn from our experience? Well, number one, as I've been mentioning, the large market provided by a continental free trade agreement is transformational for domestic firms and is essential for attracting foreign direct investment. But maybe the most important lesson is that free trade by itself is not sufficient. It's essential to have a pro-business institutional environment so that the domestic policies, domestic institutions recognize what is necessary for the enterprise sector to flourish. Let me mention also that essentially you will not obtain the benefits overnight. So here it's important to have the perspective and the patience to recognize that for long-term productivity, for long-term investment, it takes time. So what is true is immediately after membership of the EU in the 1970s, there was an increase in the growth rate, but that proved to be unsustainable. Sometimes when there's a change of regime, like a movement to free trade or more liberal finance, there's an episode of optimism, there's an inflow of finance, there's a buildup of external debt. We had that, and as night follows day, that led to stagnation in the 1980s. So it's important to maintain macro financial stability during those liberalization episodes, because unfortunately it can lead to temporary surges which prove to be unsustainable. So what we had was, throughout the 1980s, a difficult trap of low growth, high immigration, high debt. So it's only towards the end of the 1980s, when the macro financial situation was stabilized and when the external conditions improved, that we were able to take advantage of free trade. So think about that. We joined the European Union in 1973, and economic success only started to take root in the late 80s, and in fact only really became solid in the mid-1990s. So this took a long time to really fully be realized. Economic activity is so low. So the chicken and the egg, it's important to go forward to build out infrastructure, where part of that was certainly financed by European Union cohesion and structural funds. So that was quite important. But I think in the end, in addition to finance, in addition to education, a very important concept which was really important to have embedded in the Irish system is the predictability of the institutional framework. So for foreign investors, if a foreign investor is going to make a large long-term investment, that foreign investor has to be confident that the whole institutional framework is committed to openness. So no matter which party becomes elected into power, there is a kind of treaty, a constitutional, an institutional commitment to maintaining free trade, to maintaining a pro-business environment. So what that means is the kind of features that show up in the World Bank's Doing Business Index. There's good scores there, and those scores are there not just for this year, but predictably into the future. And these include an efficient legal system, an agile labour market, and reliable infrastructures, both public and business infrastructures. So what can we expect if you have all of that in place? Is, especially for a small country, it doesn't mean you end up doing everything. There's a limit on resources, choices need to be made, there are fixed costs of specialising in any given industry. So there remains quite a lot of strategic thinking to be done about what are the best industries for my country, what can I do to build up critical mass and clusters and so on. So building a decent industrial policy is always going to be tricky. Every country will have a different answer, but I think that's quite important. Let me emphasize it's important to recognize that downturns do happen. There are global reversals, there are changes in sentiment. No matter what you might tell to the credit rating agencies, global investors are prone to fluctuations in their degree of optimism. So all of that means is that it's essential in an open economy that fiscal space is maintained, and if you like, I'm not sure what the correct phrasing here is, but financial space is maintained. So for us as a central bank or as a regulator, this means that the financial system is well capitalized. So the financial system can take losses during a downturn. It means that there's a social safety net so that workers who lose jobs in a given industry can be supported and make the transition also through retraining when there's a shift in demand for different occupational skills. Now, let me also emphasize, so far I've emphasized maybe exporting, but of course a lot of the gains from trade is from importing. At a basic level in the global supply chain, in order to export, it's necessary to import those intermediate goods and capital goods that are necessary. But more broadly, the only way the gains to specialization can be achieved is if a country consciously realizes it can only do so much. It's going to focus on certain industries for production and rely on importing to maintain the full range of consumption and investment opportunities in other sectors. So of course, this is just the basic classic argument for free trade. It's two-way. The gains are both through exporting and through importing. Now, in terms of the financial system, as was mentioned earlier on, some of this is plumbing. It's necessary to have access to trade finance, good cross-border payment systems. In relation to the role of foreign financing, let me emphasize that equity financing, whether it's foreign direct investment or equity inflows through the stock market, is really a very important way of managing the risks of international trade. Now, in relation to debt financing, as I mentioned earlier on, foreign currency debt is always going to be a risky issue, but the more you have foreign currency earnings through exporting, the easier it is to manage the risks associated with foreign currency debt. And so when the central bank, the regulator, the finance ministry is looking at this, it has to go quite granular. So understanding which firms have foreign currency earnings, which firms have the capacity to sustain foreign currency debt is going to be quite important. So let me come back to this issue about governance and institutions. As I mentioned, it's quite important that it's predictable, it's durable, it can be counted upon by domestic firms and by foreign firms. But behind all of that's not a question of writing that down. Behind all of that is a social consensus, that there's a social consensus in favor of openness. So I was talking earlier on with one of the ministers about social partnership. So in the Irish situation, the commitment to openness is shared across the political system, but also between employers and trade unions, and more broadly across society. And that really, I think, is quite important. So let me make one comment, which I alluded to earlier on, which is the financial system can go through a boom-bust cycle that can interact with international openness. So, as was just mentioned by the rapporteur here, we've been in a post-crisis recovery phase most recently. But what happened between 2003 2008, which was a classic real estate boom and bust cycle, had nothing to do with the export sector. It is an unfortunate distraction. It really is a timely reminder that the domestic sector can cause problems. It is entirely a domestic problem, if you like. So what that means is that in addition to focusing on what's necessary for international trade, it's always important to keep an eye on what's going on in the domestic non-traded sector, and it's very important for central banks and for regulators to be interventionist, to be active in maintaining those financial risks. So let me sum up by saying it's difficult to exaggerate the role the European Union has played in Ireland's convergence to European living standards. And let me emphasize is that it's not free trade on its own. It's the fact that free trade provides an opportunity, but to exploit that opportunity, having a good domestic business environment, which in turn is underpinned by good public policies in terms of education, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of macro financial stability. So I think in some of those remarks, I hope maybe there's some lessons for you to think about. I look forward during the course of the rest of today to learning more about the Continental Free Trade Agreement. In terms of follow-up, I'm sure we would be very happy to elaborate on any questions you may have if you make contact with us. So again, let me thank you for the invitation, and let me wish you the best for the rest of today's proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you to the Governor of the Central Bank of Ireland, Philip Lane, there, thinking about the AFCFTA as a platform, not just for trading with ourselves, but with the rest of the world, is definitely food for thought. Now, Ethiopia is not only home to the African Union Commission and the UN Economic Commission for Africa, it's also one of the fastest growing economies in Africa. We heard about growth of 8.8%. And I speak to a lot of investors in my other job, job on my television show. And when I ask them where to invest, Ethiopia is always on the list. Now, the FCFTA offers all our countries, including Ethiopia, a chance to expand the markets and create more employment. So to give the official opening address for the Conference of African Ministers of Finance, Planning and Economic Development 2018, it gives me great pleasure to call to the podium His Excellency, the Prime Minister of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia.
Thank you. Honorable Ministers, Governors of Central Banks, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Addis Ababa, a city happy and grateful to host the Economic Commission for Africa, ECA, our 60 years old veteran United Nations institutions. A happy anniversary and a happy birthday, ECA. As we all know, every anniversary involves a critical and reflective engagement with the past, the present, and the future. It is with this sense of purpose that we should reflect on milestones achieved and amidst throughout the years of ensure we apply lessons learned and designed a better ECA together. It was 60 years ago that His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie made a strong appeal at the first session of the ECA on December 1958. He recounted the plight of the African continent plunged in paradox, endowed with valuable natural resources, yet mired in the senseless poverty and dependent on others to finance its own development and propel transformation. In his speech, Imperial Haile Selassie urged the support of member states to raise the living standards of people through the promotion and diversification of exports, improved agricultural techniques, establishment of regional common market, and the creation of research hub to inform policy. Every time I recall these prophetic statements from the Emperor, I ask where we are today. On each of the points he raised long time ago, the answer is simple and straightforward. Each of this issue is as relevant today as they were back then. In some cases, they are even more so today than 6 decades ago. Food security is far from assured, and our regional and continental economic integration programs are far behind where they need to be. I can go on and on. However, I'm with you today to not merely recount the past, but to celebrate our collective achievements, of which there are many. Importantly, I am also here to challenge us to learn from history and look into future by exercising wisdom that comes with maturity. The Economic Commission for Africa had indeed been at the forefront of cutting-edge policy research, thought leadership, and advice since day one. In fact, it has been our very own in-house think tank that helped us champion our continental aspiration with the deal of a missionary. However, in the spirit of the African unity, the ECA did not work alone. Founded only 5 years after the ECA, the Organization of African Union, OAU, has been championing the African cause since the signing of the Charter on the organization in 1963. The OAU had made many objectives, but at its heart was the liberation of the continent from colonial rule, racism, discrimination, and exploitation. Ethiopia may have celebrated the 122nd anniversary of the victory of the Battle of Addis this year. However, freedom was a long time coming in our continent. It was delayed but unstoppable. African independence leaders helped orchestrate and intensify the struggle to bring freedom to the entire continent throughout the decades. The OAU was spectacular in that regard. Unfortunately, despite expelling our colonial oppressor out of the continent, we started turning increasingly against each other. We dumped our spirits and conflicts became the norm. We even became highly valued customers for weapon manufacturing companies around the world until we learned our lesson at a very high cost. Slowly and steadily, we started developing homegrown means to prevent and to resolve our conflicts by ourselves. The transformation of the Organization of African Unity into the African Union was a turning point in this respect. Today, the African Union is able and ready to intervene in all sorts of government-sponsored abuse of human rights, and the OAU could. It also does not recognize any leader who comes to power through non-constitutional means. With such political accomplishment on its record, the AU is also now accelerating its impact in economic integration of the continent, which was already an objective identified in the 1963 Charter, but deprioritized as internal strife and civil war took precedence. A recent example on the success of witnessed in this regard is the historic signing of the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area in Kigali in March this year, which was signed by 44 African countries. The Protocol on Free Movement Persons was another success and is signed by more than half the membership. The opening of our skies with launch of the single African air transport market is yet another addition. Equally important, the African Union reform process under the able leadership of His Excellency Paul Kagame, President of the Republic of Rwanda and current chairperson of the AU, Assembly facilitates economic integration. I applaud the African Union leadership for these hope-inspiring initiatives and accomplishments. Needless to say, the ECA has been there with us throughout our efforts to identify our challenges and address them in our own way. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, today our deliberations at this conference are being held under the theme African Continental Free Trade Area and Physical Space for Job and Economic Diversification. The theme is timely and considerable value to each of our countries. As policymakers, finance ministers, and central bank governors, we look to you for leadership that will ensure that trade is not an end in itself, but the means to advance the well-being of Africans. I am sure many of you are aware that here in Ethiopia, we have been engaged in an ambitious program of upgrading our infrastructure, building industrial parks, and formulating industrial policy and strategies to support the development of our industry. Our efforts have led to meaningful improvement in foreign direct investment, to a significant part because we have established an increasingly more business-friendly Ethiopia. Our efforts have also yielded tangible results as evidenced in the growing share of the industrial sector's contribution to our economy. With the African Continental Free Trade Agreement in place, and once it enters into force in particular, I am confident that the opportunities for us to attract more investment will only increase. The Continental Free Trade Agreement should be shaped and implemented so as to enable Africa to create opportunities for its citizenry, to spur our industrialization agenda, to ensure inclusive development for all Africans, and in particular, women and the youth. Together, we will grow. Together, we will give our young people a stake in the future of our continent. We will harness their energy and creativity for the collective well-being. We need to increasingly engage the private sector in ensuring economic integration and introduce aggressive policies to broaden women's access to economic opportunities. Ethiopia is fully aware of the opportunities that the free trade agreement offers and is ready to follow Rwanda and Ghana for their pioneering role in the ratification of the agreement. I wish to urge all of you to do so to ensure that it can come into force sooner. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine the progress we could make if we silenced the guns, empowered our communities, and built a stronger institution. Imagine if you don't radiate a negative energy. Imagine if you don't invest all our resources to kill each other. Imagine if we love each other as nations, as Africans, and nurture on our values to transform our citizens. What should Africa become by 2030? How about by 2063? How can the ECA continue to assist the continent to attain this collective vision? How do we enhance the competitiveness of African industry on the global market? How do you foster South-South and North-South economic cooperation? Ministers, governors, experts, ladies and gentlemen, we must all employ our talent to build a competitive Africa. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is in fact an important step that has heralded the establishment of the world's largest free trade area. On this anniversary, ECA shall look back with pride and look forward with hope. ECA shall marshal all its resources to support the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. ECA has been with us for 60 years. I am confident it will be there for the next phase of African development. I thank you for your attention, and I declare the conference is officially opened. Thank you very much.
And thank you for those strong and plain words, Your Excellency. Now, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the AU Commissioner Sacco, the Commissioner of Agriculture and Rural Economy, who's joined us, present here. And also I notice in the far corner over there, the new Executive Director of UN Habitat. You are very welcome, madam, because cities, please give her a round of applause. She's come from Kenya, because it cannot be underestimated how important cities and urban areas to the AFCFTA's prospective future. So you're very welcome. It's great to see you. Now we've come to the point where in a few minutes we're going to be tasting one of the finest exports that Ethiopia has, coffee, and it's good. But before we do that, I'm going to ask the ministers that are here, the representatives of the ministers who are here, and all of you, the special guests who actually are going to be on the podium or have been on the podium, to find the ushers at the back and have them lead you to the area where we will be doing the group photo with His Excellency, who's gratefully agreed to join us for that, the group family photo. Could I ask everybody else to please rise and stay in your seats, well, rise where you're sitting and acknowledge the Prime Minister of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. Thank him for his attendance as he leaves.